Hello, and thank you for checking in to our ACANY and Life Plan virtual learning session for April 16th, 2026. This is Creating Sensory Supportive Environments, a practical guide for home and school. In this session, our presenter, Katie Kirkman, shares practical, real-world strategies for understanding sensory processing and creating environments that better support neurodivergent individuals. Throughout this presentation, you'll learn how different sensory systems work and why sensory experiences can feel overwhelming for some individuals, what sensory overload looks like and how it affects behavior, regulation, and daily functioning, practical tips for creating sensory supportive spaces at home and at school, including lighting, sound, organization, and routines, and strategies to support regulation beyond the environment, such as breaks, movement, and co-regulation. This presentation is especially helpful for parents, caregivers, family members, educators, and professionals who support autistic and other neurodivergent children or adults. It's also valuable for anyone looking to better understand sensory needs and create more inclusive, supportive spaces. We hope that you find this session practical, validating, and full of ideas you can use right away. Let's get started.
Thank you so much, Kate. It's really nice to be here this evening, and I thank you all for taking time out of your busy lives to be with us. Tonight, I'm speaking about creating sensory supportive environments. I hope that it is a practical guide for you. I'm going to be speaking about both the home and the school environment, depending on who's in our audience, so that you can take away different ideas for different places. There is a lot of crossover between both. I'm really excited. I like talking about this topic. I think it's really fun. So welcome. Please make yourselves comfortable. You can have your camera on or off. Either way, it doesn't matter to me. We have the chat open if you would like to ask questions or participate in any way. I have a few things that I might be asking you. If you would like to contribute, you can do so in the chat. My name is Katie, like Kate said. I am a Master's of Education and a BCBA. I have been working with neurodivergent children since 2006, and I am located in New York City. I used to teach in the public school system, and I now do work with the Nest Support Project at NYU and with the Department of Education at St. John's University. And I also provide direct support to families. My interests and my passions include creating inclusive and sensory safe spaces, supporting behavior, and supporting neuroaffirming instructional practices. I'm really happy to be here with you this evening. And I'd like to know who you are a little bit. I'm assuming we've got some families, maybe some neurodivergent individuals, maybe some teachers or therapists with us. Anybody want to tell me who you are or what your role is, why you've joined us in the chat?
Hi, my name is Karen Labar. My daughter's Grace. She's 20. She has ADHD and autism.
Awesome, Karen. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing with us.
Yep.
It seems like at this time we might have more families than we might have practitioners. I'm going to speak to both groups, but I will try to be heavy on the family information this evening. But it's great to have everyone with us. Let's do a quick check-in. How are you feeling today? Personally, I'm getting over being sick, and so I'm very happy to be here with you. I love sharing this information, but I'm not super energetic. So that's going to guide my presentation this evening. Maybe you had something going on. Maybe you had a stressful day. Maybe you're happy the weather's changing. Whatever it is that you're feeling, I hope that you can bring that into the session with you tonight. Hi, Zachary. It's good to see you. Feeling good. I'm so glad. Whatever you're feeling, let's bring it into the session. I always like to start off presentations with an invitation to sort of ground. I'm going to take 3 deep breaths, and I'm going to invite you to take those breaths with me. this is an opportunity for us to let go of the day so far, let go of whatever might be stressful, and hopefully bring our focus and attention into this session for the next hour or so, so that we can get the most out of it. So I'm going to take 3 deep breaths, and I invite you to do the same if you would like. So I'm going to breathe in through my nose and out through my mouth. And that always helps bring me into the moment and feel grounded and ready for the information. It's great to have everyone here. I see we've got grandparents and guardians with us. That's awesome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So today's session is going to be 4 parts. I'm going to start us off with some information about understanding the senses, because that's going to really inform how we know how to make changes in our environment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sensory experiences, especially for neurodivergent individuals. And then I'm going to talk about how to create sensory safe spaces. I'm going to give you direct tips, and I'm going to show you some examples of good sensory safe ideas. And then I'm going to talk to you about how to support regulation outside of just the environment. And then finally, we will have a good amount of time for some questions and answers if anybody has anything that they'd like to talk about more. So let's start with understanding the senses. Let me know in the chat if you think you know the answer. How many senses are there? How many senses do you think there are? How many senses do we have? Getting some 5, 6. What do we think? 5. Yeah. So a lot of people talk about the 5 senses. Those are the senses that we learn about in school, right? And so these are things that our brains are taking in from the environment. So we've got a tactile system, or a system of touch. We've got a auditory system, or the system of sound and hearing. We've got a gustatory system, the system of taste. We've got a olfactory system, or the system of smell. And we have a visual system, or the system of sight. And so all of these things, touching, listening, tasting, smelling, seeing, are part of our sensory system. And these are things that our brain takes in and gets information about our environment. But did you know that there are 3 additional senses? Yeah, I see some head shaking. You did know, right? These are the senses that aren't talked about as much. Maybe it's because they're not as fun. Personally, I like tasting and eating and smelling food, so that seems more fun than some of these senses. But there are additional senses that our brain is making sense of. And so 2 of those I like to call the movement senses. So we have a proprioceptive system where it's telling us about our body parts, how much force is needed to lift a glass, how much force is needed to open or shut a door. Where is my arm related to my body? How can I plan for different types of movements? Excuse me. And then we also have a vestibular sense. And this is the sense for movement and balance, and knowing where your head is in relation to other things. So knowing how to walk through a room without bumping into other people, knowing when to stop before getting to the top of some stairs, right? Those are your movement senses. And we also have a sensory system that lets our brain know about feelings that are happening inside our bodies. And this is called the interoceptive system. And so anytime you have a stomach ache, or maybe you feel nervous, or maybe you feel like you have to go to the bathroom, maybe you feel hungry, maybe you have heart palpitations because you're getting excited. This is information from the inside of your body that's telling brain information about what's going on with you. The key here is that we know that neurodivergent folks sometimes have difficulty with these sensory processing mechanisms. This is a website called Autism West Midlands. I'm actually just going to put that into the chat because it is a really great group in the UK, a really good resource. And I found a quote here that talks about this sensory processing different in neurodivergent folks. And they say, we all experience the world through our senses, and our brains interpret the sensations for us so that we can make sense of our experiences and take appropriate action. For example, we feel cold, so we put on a jumper or a sweater. Because we experience many sensations at once, our brains have a filter system that helps us to pay attention only to what is most important and relevant at the time. This filter system may not work the same in autistic and neurodivergent people. So we know that the process of sensing the world is different in a neurodivergent brain. And this leads sometimes to what we know as stimming. How many of you have heard or experienced stimming before? Heard of or experienced stimming before? Yeah, Zachary says, I know. So stimming is something that often neurodivergent people do with their bodies in order to process and get sensory input. So Ruth Simone, who is an autistic advocate from the site Aspergirls, says stimming is something we do to ourselves to soothe ourselves when we're upset, anxious, overloaded, or in pain, to release unpleasant feelings or energy. Also, stimming can happen because of an overflow of positive emotion. And so we know that stimming is something that happens when the brain is processing information. Oftentimes, it's an indication of overwhelm, but many times it can also be an indication of joy. And one big takeaway for tonight is that stimming is okay. A lot of the sort of taboo around stimming is because sometimes different motions or movements can make neurotypical people feel nervous. But if we look at it through a different perspective and say, you know what, that's something that they're doing with their body to regulate their nervous system, we can be more understanding. The Chronic Couple is an advocacy couple online that puts it this way. They say, imagine if you had an intense itch on your arm, but you were forbidden from scratching it for fear of making others uncomfortable. That's how it feels when neurodivergent people aren't allowed to stim in public. Repetitive behaviors or stimming help to comfort us, but our comfort has never been the priority, and this has to change. And so a big part of what I want you to take away this evening is knowing that these behaviors often happen for a reason, and they might be really benefiting your self or your child or your student or your friend's nervous system. And so let's think about how stimming might be connected to the senses. Personally, I actually have one of these fidgets that I keep on my desk when I'm in meetings, when I'm giving presentations. It helps me focus. To be able to see this and hear it and touch it and let it be able to do its thing focuses me for whatever reason that might be. And so you might have people who like to hold something or fidget with something in their hands. Oftentimes, kids and other adults like to stim visually. They might be looking at something. Bubbles often bring up stims in students. I've often seen people who put things in their mouths. Chewing your fingernails can be considered a stim, right? Seeking that oral information. Oftentimes there are clapping or flapping or different types of hand movements that folks do in order to gain visual or sensory information. And then we've also seen full body movements, things like spinning or rocking. Does any of this sound familiar to you? Do you know anybody who stims? Yeah, definitely. Great. So it's funny because there are some stims that are like more neuronormative than others, like chewing one's fingernails. That's a personal stim that I have been trying to cut down on for myself because I don't like the way it makes my nails look or the germs, but that's sort of something that we see more typical. Karen says, my daughter jumps up and down, right? Potentially, you might have seen people looking at your daughter funny because jumping up and down is not necessarily as accepted as chewing one's nails, but they're serving very different, very similar purposes, right? Yeah, flapping hands, spinning around, those types of things. So your people you know who do these stims are getting information for their nervous systems that help to calm their nervous systems. They're not harming themselves or others. It's usually okay. So I do want to talk a little bit about challenges with sensory processing. Neurodivergent learners' tolerance for some sensory experiences may be much lower or much higher than their neurotypical peers. So they might have difficulty recognizing when they're becoming overstimulated. Therefore, they might frequently experience sensory overload. Not all the time can stimming help to push off this overload. And that's probably one of the main reasons we're here, right? So Jane Aris is a PhD and an autistic advocate, and they describe sensory processing disorder as being like a neurological traffic jam that prevents certain parts of the brain from receiving the information needed to interpret sensory information correctly. So you might notice that you are connected to the parent of, in a family with, or you yourself might get into different sensory environments and become overwhelmed quite easily. You might feel very sensitive to those environments. And that's kind of what we're talking about here tonight. So oftentimes, this experience of the senses can be hypersensitivity or hyposensitivity. Hypersensitivity can also be thought of as being oversensitive. People who are oversensitive or have hypersensitivities might cultivate sensory avoidant needs, right? They might show signs of being over-responsive in certain environments. They might cover their ears. They might put on dark glasses or cover themselves from light. They might not like to be touched. And they're the kind of folks who require support in mitigating that sensory overload. Versus hyposensitivities, which are more known as undersensitivities. This is where folks might cultivate sensory seeking needs. They might show signs of under responsiveness to the environment. So they might be moving around a lot. They might be putting things in their mouth, touching things. They might be grabbing onto you and looking to get hugs and squeezes. These might be the kids who are always sitting up on your lap, right? And these folks are going to require support in providing more activity to get to sensory information. Now, something that can get a little tricky is that people don't usually fall into one or the other category. In fact, people can have hypersensitivity to some things and hyposensitivity to others. So we have to be very thoughtful and look for signs when we're looking at ourselves or when we're looking at our families who are neurodivergent. Yeah, Linda says I experience both in my classroom, especially in K1. You know what else I have to say is if you're working with young people, they might still be developing their sensory systems. And so they might be exploring, and this could be really a natural part of their development. So let's look at some examples and let me know in the chat if these are things that you have seen before. Okay, does this sound familiar to you? And I want you to notice the items that I have highlighted in yellow indicate hypersensitivity. And the items that I have highlighted in blue indicate hyposensitivity. So let's talk about those. So writing with too little pressure, not putting down enough pressure on the paper when you put the pen or the crayon to the paper, right? Bumping into people or objects, having a poor posture, slumping down in your seat. Using excessive pressure when writing or difficulty with fine motor skills. Seeking out sensory input, chewing on pencils, chewing on shirt sleeves, chewing on toys, different types of things, chewing on your fingernails. Poor motor planning or using extreme force during tasks. I have to admit that this is me a little bit. I tend to be a slammer. I slam doors and I slam cabinets, and I don't mean to. I think that my brain just doesn't plan properly the amount of force, and I always end up using too much. I think that's why I wasn't ever that good at sports. Or maybe poor awareness of your position in space. Maybe somebody is constantly moving and fidgeting. Do these things sound familiar to you? Yes, definitely. And so if you're thinking specifically about a person you know who is neurodivergent, you can find some patterns. Zachary is noticing patterns too. You've got some hyper and hyposensitivities, it looks like. Yeah. So this is interesting to think about yourself. Excuse me. Of course, Dejeuner, we are going to send out the recording of this session and the slides within the next week. Thank you for asking. Notice little ones bumping into people and things or pressing hard on the pencil. Yeah. Oh, chewing is a good one. Yeah. Sensitive to doors closing. Great. These are really good examples. Okay, so overall, we know that challenges with sensory processing can sometimes lead to challenges in other areas. Difficulty taking in or interpreting sensory information can lead to challenges with interactions with other people, especially if we don't know those people, because they might not understand. It can lead to difficulty with daily functioning. It can lead to difficulty with social and family relationships, especially due to a lack of understanding. It can lead to difficulty with behavior, with regulating emotions, and eventually can potentially lead to difficulty with self-esteem and with learning. And that's really why I want to provide this information so that it becomes more widely known, so that we can normalize the idea that some brains take in sensory information differently. And we can move into the next portion where we talk about creating sensory safe spaces so that some of those challenges are mitigated. And so that's where we're going to start now. I have this quote from one of my favorite autistic advocates named Lydia Brown. They are actually an attorney in the advocacy field, one of the smartest people I've ever listened to. And I love this quote. I think it's a really good one to keep in mind as we're thinking about creating sensory safe environments. So I'm going to read this quote from Lydia Brown. Lydia says, "To talk about accepting people for who they are does not mean depriving or denying people of access to supports and to accommodation and in ways that make sense for them and that they may want. But it is recognizing that nobody's brain is wrong or bad, and there's no wrong way to have a body." So this is really a twofold quote here. First, she says that you have to recognize that nobody's brain is wrong or bad, and there's no wrong way to have a body. So that's highlighting that, yep, some people experience sensory input in a different way, and that's okay. Stimming might be one way they deal with it, right? And then they go on to say, to talk about accepting people for where they are does not mean depriving them of their needs. And so when we have accessible spaces, when we have accessible things and tools and supports in place, that is what acceptance really is. Acceptance is not saying you're fine as long as you act like me. Acceptance is saying you're fine because you act like you. And I find this to be a really powerful quote. And I have to say that lately I have been noticing there are more sensory safe spaces popping up in places like concert venues, conferences. I can't remember where I was, but I just saw a place to take a break to have a sensory. Oh, you know what? It was at the Museum of Natural History, they have a sensory space room actually for people who might be feeling overwhelmed and who might need a bit of a break. And so I do think that these types of talks and learning to use this language and having all of us share our knowledge really is changing the world for better, and that we are becoming a more accepting place for folks whose brains work a little bit differently. So that's my message of hope for this evening. But let's think about how we can create sensory neutral environments to reduce sensory stimulation. And first, I want us to think about, what does a sensory unfriendly environment look like? Oh, Jessica says, I got to the point as an autism parent, I felt like I had to hand out business cards to explain my kids. That is a very common feeling, Jessica, and I feel you there. I really do. So let's talk about what sensory unfriendly environments might be. So if you're looking at a space and you say, wow, it's really bright in here, or the light is really reflecting in a lot of different ways, or maybe it's very loud and echoey, or maybe there's chaos in the movement, or things are very unpredictable. Maybe even it's smelly, or there's a strong sense of smell. These are all contributors to sensory overstimulation. Some other contributors that I want to talk about are things like the adult or the teacher's voice, volume, and rate of speech. Sometimes, excuse me, a lot of teachers, especially when we work with young kids, and I don't exclude myself from this group. This is something I had to learn myself. We talk in a high-pitched or very fast-paced voice, but that is not really good for our students, especially the ones who have sensory sensitivities. Lowering our voice and slowing down can be more beneficial to them. Having unexpected changes in the schedule or in the routine can be very dysregulating and contribute to overstimulation. A feeling of being rushed or having unclear expectations, having a lack of visual support can also contribute to overstimulation. Having clutter around on different surfaces or up on the walls can also contribute to a sense of visual overstimulation, and of course, smells. Yeah, Renee says my little girl does not like brightness. She makes her iPad dark instead of bright. Wow, and that's really awesome that she's able to advocate for herself in that way. Michelle says calls loud voices irritating. Yep, I've heard that before. I have to put the hallway light instead of the bathroom light in the morning when she gets up. Yep, that's very common, and these are perfect examples. You all are leading me into the next portion where I'm going to give you some very specific tips in some different areas. So our goal is to create sensory safe environments so our students are set up to succeed, to plan with these needs in mind instead of waiting for the meltdown or the shutdown. So we are talking about proactive and preventative tips right now. And I'm going to talk about 4 areas for you to think about. Many of them do end up connecting to each other, so you might feel like it is multiple times in the same category, but this is kind of how I broke things up. I'm going to talk about lighting tips. I'm going to talk about sound tips. I'm going to talk about organization tips, and I'm going to talk about routines. So let's get started with lighting. My number 1 tip is to use fluorescent light. Not to use fluorescent lights, to use natural lights when possible. Fluorescent lights are very hard for many neurodivergent people. You can see them and you can hear them. And so when possible, it's really great to use natural light or maybe lamp light instead of bright overhead lights. You can use light as a signal for different activities. So you can use lights to separate different times of days or separate different activities. It's important to allow students to wear sunglasses or have dark space breaks, right? Like we heard in the chat, Some kids even lower the light on their iPad because they're sensitive to that. Maybe they need a hallway light instead of the overhead light. It's important to allow students to have breaks. And we know that other sources of light, like screens, also have an impact on our kids. And so it's important to incorporate breaks from those light sources throughout the day. Importantly, similarly, if you are going to be changing the lighting by turning them on or off, it's really important to just give a little warning, right? Yes, seizures can be induced with different flashers and screens. And so it's important to be able to have a place for them to escape light, have breaks from screens, and have warnings when the light is going to change. These are some examples that I put together. I would love if you continue adding to the chat. If you see things or if you have things that you're doing that are connected, we would love to hear from you. All the more better, to have more tips. Excuse me. So I've put a picture here of a lamp because lamps are a great source of light, often better than the overheads. I love nowadays they have these really cool lamps that can put different color lights out. Maybe they project different space images, or they're the kind of lights that you can use to stim and touch. Those are really great things to have in your home as sensory safe, potentially sensory safe ideas for kids to engage with. There are really great ways to cover up overhead lights. I've lately been seeing these like rainbow or cloudscapes that create a really dreamy light and take away some of the sound and buzzing from the fluorescence. That's something, of course, that you would need to talk to your custodial staff about if you work in a school. I've often seen people using things like fairy lights or string lights inside bedrooms or in spaces, in school spaces, because they create a calmer environment. I love all of those ideas a lot. And then I thought this was pretty cool too. They have light bulbs now that are actually relatively affordable that you can connect to your smartphone and change the color. And not only is this great for changing color, setting a nice calm mood, but you can use it for cueing. And so I have this example of using a light to cue a bedtime routine. And so when the light is on a soft yellow mode, that's just the normal mode. But when the light switches to green, that's a clue for this family that it's the evening time and bedtime is coming up. When that light turns to yellow, that's the cue that it's time to get ready for bed. And when that light turns to red, that means it is time to stay in bed. You're busted if you come out of your room. So I thought that was pretty cool. It doesn't have to be a bedtime routine, but you can use light to cue different types of routines. Oh, Dejane says, I use that with my daughter. I use the red light. It's also good to induce melatonin for sleep. How interesting. What a great connection. I love to hear that you're already doing these things. Yeah, if anybody has other light tips that they're doing, we would love to hear them. There's no better place than the community to find good ideas. I've got hallway lamp night lights instead of overhead lights, which is a great idea. Turning the brightness down on the screen. Very good. Excuse me. I had a kitty night light that changes when you tap it, right? And you know what I really like about that, Renee, is that when you tap it, that also gives the control to your child so that they can help be a part of their environment, right? If they tap it, maybe that changes for them. If they're feeling scared or if they need something different, they can tap it and change it. That's awesome. Really great ideas here. Okay, shall we move on to talking about tips for sound? So, like I talked about a little bit before, yeah, Linda says sometimes the students will fight over the light. It's a constant battle. We do have lamps that we turn on as well. Awesome. It's really important, Linda, to connect the light with some routines, which maybe after the routine section, you can get some ideas for how to make it less of a battle in your classroom. So some sound tips. It's important to reduce the volume of your voice. Just because you're talking louder doesn't mean you're heard more. In fact, if you're talking in a lower voice, kids might have an easier time processing what you're saying. This is something that, again, I'm seeing become more and more common in learning spaces, but headphones and earplugs can help decrease auditory stimuli. And just because someone is wearing headphones doesn't mean they can't hear you. More often than not, if they have on headphones that aren't playing music, they can hear the important stuff that's going on. It's just the background noise that's buzzing. It's just creating a filter system that their brain doesn't have. You can also think about how your spaces increase sound absorption. And so it can be really important to have things like carpets, bean bags, fluffy things on the bottoms of chairs so that they don't make as much noise when they're moving around. Think about absorbing sound from the outside. Sometimes curtains can help with that, right? It's very important to support auditory instructions visually. Oftentimes, if our kids are having a lot of trouble processing everything going around in the environment, they need your instructions to be written down so that their brain can get to them on their own time. Yeah, Renee says, some sounds are big: hair dryers, drills, vacuum, washing machine, bothersome. This is a really good point. It's important to have a system where you warn your autistic child or friend, hey, I'm about to put the hair dryer on. I'm going to use it in this room and I'm going to shut the door. You might want to use some headphones, right? Exactly. I also heard when you wear the noise cancellation headphones too long, then you never learn to tolerate noise. Oh, Celeste, this is a really interesting point, okay? So the idea of becoming tolerant and habitualizing to sound is something that's really about the neurotypical brain. A lot of research indicates that neurodivergent individuals who have sensory processing differences in their brain, they don't actually ever learn to tolerate or habitualize. So that just means that there's never going to be a time when they're okay with the noise. Their brains don't necessarily work like that. So I think that's a really important topic that you bring up. Providing headphones can be a lifelong tool that can really help with blocking out noise for people who over time, instead of tolerating it, it actually becomes worse for them. Really nice point that you bring up. Yeah, a lot of overstimulation with your daughter, Jishna. Yeah, of course. Run water, right? Yeah, running water. Bathrooms and toilets can be loud places with a lot of sensitivities. It's important. Something else that I find for sound, there's certain things that you can't necessarily control, right? There's certain environments. Maybe there's construction outside of your classroom. What I've found is that mitigating visual clutter and other types of overstimulation can help with the amount of input that the sound is giving. So like turning the lights lower in the bathroom when the water is running, different things like that to help a space feel more safe. Something else that I think is a really great idea, this is more of a classroom idea, but if you have a large family, this might actually also work for you too in your home, but honoring different sound needs by having sound zones. And that just means that maybe you have a zone of your home or a zone of your classroom where low music is playing and it's a place where people can talk with a partner because that's how they engage, right? They like to have the sound input. Versus maybe there's an area of your home or an area of your classroom that is quiet and there is no talking and communication is done in another way. And that can be a place where if someone is feeling overwhelmed, they can go there to get the silence that they need. So here are some of my examples of these tips. And like I said, keep putting them into the chat. It's really helpful to have this direct feedback. Excuse me. But at home, you can, and at school, a lot of these things are for both, but You can use headphones and earplugs anytime. And like I said, these things don't block out all sound. They just help be the filter that the neurodivergent brain is not. Putting those tennis balls on the bottom of chairs, anytime I'm in a classroom where the chairs are squeaking, that's like the number one thing I notice. Having carpets. So some other ideas that are connected to sound include things like having a voice scale to let folks know in this time our voices are low, or in this time our voices are high, right? Letting kids be able to visually help modulate the sound of their voice. I have often seen people using sound in a way that is supportive because kids enjoy sound. So there's so many great YouTube videos and channels that are like jellyfish under the sea. I know the Monterey Bay Aquarium has some really neat video footage of just calming scenes that can be visually and sound really calming. I know that many kids really respond highly to music and like to explore sound. So you can have specific times of the day where you pull out instruments or you pull out things that make sound so they can explore. And then another idea that I think is a good thing to do at school, but mostly at home, is establish family quiet time. This can be a time of low sensory input, of some downtime where people can process and feel a little bit calmer. You would need to explain to the family why it's important for everyone to participate. You can have a family meeting to decide on what it might look like. What are some things you can do during quiet time? Establish those rules and then set your mind on making it happen, right? And be persistent. You might be surprised to see how well your family responds to having some downtime instead of always having to have an activity. All right, I'm going to check the chat now. Yes, if it's too loud at night. Yeah, not flushing. Oh my gosh, there's so many of these sound-oriented tips. I know that at schools, sometimes there's automatic flushers. And so I've seen teachers put post-it notes over the sensor so that it won't flush while the kid is still there. Or you can have a system where somebody else just comes behind and flushes. That's totally okay. Yeah, earplugs or headphones are a really great idea. If they're not putting them on, Michelle, yeah, sometimes that happens because the actual feeling of those is not helpful. Keep exploring, give them some time. There might come a time when earplugs or headphones can be more tolerated. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Headband, that's a really great idea. You can make your own, right? I'm glad that you're looking forward to being able to move soon, Zachary. It sounds like your environment is very overstimulating. Yeah, when the toilet would auto flush screaming. I have so many kids. I have a lot of neurotypical kids who are afraid of the toilets as well. So yeah, trying to mitigate, trying to step in and have somebody else use that auto flush function. All right. Moving right along, let's talk about tips for organization. Excuse me for 1 second. Oh. So, my tips for organization. It's important to think both through your physical or your visual organization, as well as procedural organization. So, think about how you can reduce visual clutter. This is a big one. Things are covered, put away, put in their place so that you only have out what's really necessary in that moment. This could be a tip with some of the bathroom and shower stuff. Maybe just only have out what's really needed in the moment. In the bathroom, if it's brushing teeth, maybe just only have out visually what's needed for brushing teeth in that moment. And when it's not needed, put it inside of a cabinet or get a basket for it. In your classrooms, it's important to have alternate seating options for kids. They don't have to always sit in the same kind of chair. Provide visual schedules. So think about what your procedural organization is and lay that out for kids. This will enhance independence and a sense of controls over the environments when you use visuals. I think you're going to understand what I'm talking about with my examples for this one a little bit more. So visually, think about, what are you expecting kids to pay attention to? If it's out, they're going to pay attention to it. Can your child self-manage during a certain task? Is there a place for everything, and do they know where those things go? This one is also important, but is your color scheme or your theme calming or overwhelming? Do you have tons of bright colors everywhere, or are you really sticking to just a few colors, right? Because those things can add to visual stimulation. And then in terms of procedural, think about, do students know what to expect each period of the day? Does your child know what to expect when they get home, when it's dinner time, when it's bedtime? Are there familiar routines to help ground? If someone is getting overstimulated, is there a routine that can help ground them? And do you have ways of keeping those procedures on track? So these are some examples here. This on the side that says at home, this is a choice board. This is a summer activity choice board, but this parent just drew very quick rudimentary drawings of a bike, of a drive, of the beach, or of water balloons. And the kid can choose, or you might put an order of what you're going to do that day. These are things that can be done both in the classroom and at home, but you can have a checklist. These are things to do, and they can take that and move it to all done when they finish each step. Or maybe you have an entry routine. This is an entry routine for a classroom, but you could definitely have an entry routine for a home. Enter quietly, write homework in a planner, take out your binder, and begin the activity. I have a teacher who actually put arrows with tape on the floor to guide students to know where to walk, to put things away in their cubbies. Alternate seating, where kids are allowed to stand at desks or have wobble stools or have cushions, beanbag chairs to give them some input, or even putting those exercise bands on the legs of chairs so that kids can kick them while they're in their seats to get that information. And then putting schedules up, things like unpacking or grabbing new materials. I'm just going to check the chat to see if anybody has some other ideas. a lot of sound sensitivity conversations here. Yeah, it's very normal for autistic students and children to have sensitivities to loud sounds. Very, very, very normal. Yeah, and with visuals. He will close the cover before flushing. Yeah, Ken, and just giving ways for them to practice and feel comfortable. It's not that they're going to tolerate it, but maybe they won't be as scared, if that makes sense. Good. Okay, I'm going to move on to talking about routines, which are pretty connected to the procedural organization, but it's a little more involved. So consistency and predictability are key. When kids have consistent routines and predictable schedules, they will be less anxious. And I know that you can't always know exactly what's going to happen for the whole week, but you can have little routines for things that you can teach them, and you can prime them and give them advance notice of things when you know something is coming up. It's important to create routines for support tools. So if you're like me and you like to have a fidget, you can create a routine for using that fidget so that it doesn't become like a toy in the classroom, for example, where it becomes a tool, not a toy. It's really important, both at home and at school, to have a break area, a place for escape, and a routine around using that space. It's really important to schedule time for movement. This is especially in the school setting, but making sure kids are not expected to be sitting for too long. And then importantly, both home and school, think about routines around transitions. So if you need to get in the car to go somewhere, if you need to get ready to go to bed, if you need to get ready to go to school, if you're changing from one subject to another, if you're going from one classroom to another, these are all really important transitional times that need routines around them. So like I said, I usually work in classrooms, but I think that this is really important for all environments when we're thinking about our neurodivergent kids. Having flexible expectations because, and you know this as the families of autistic and neurodivergent kiddos, not all learners pay attention in the same way. Not everybody engages in the same way. And not all learners regulate or calm themselves in the same way. Paying attention doesn't always mean making eye contact. In fact, a lot of autistic individuals have said that making eye contact actually is distracting and can be painful. And so it doesn't help pay attention. In fact, they can listen better when they're looking away. Not all learners are engaged in the same way. I famously had a student who every time I did a read aloud in my class, he would stand up and he would pace around the room. To me, it did not look like he was listening or looking at all. But when I was finished, he would be able to draw pictures and recite exactly what happened in those stories. And so I had to learn, yeah, the way he engages is through moving. And not all learners regulate or calm themselves in the same way. Some kids can jump on a trampoline for a very long time, and that helps regulate them. While for other kids, that would get them really wound up. And so we have to have flexible expectations. This whole body listening is something that is seen in a lot of classrooms. And I think that the new way to think about this is to say, how does your body help you listen, right? All brains and bodies listen and learn differently, and it's important to know what works for you. And so my advice is for classrooms and at home, think about how can I listen best? How can I learn best? What makes me feel comfortable in order to do certain things? And so these are some examples of different types of routines that you might have at home and at school. So at home, you might have a routine around taking a break or using a fidget, using an iPad, things like that. At school too. I love this visual of I can brush my teeth. Here's the things I might need, and here's the steps I take. This can be used for a lot of different routines at home. At school, you might definitely need routines around how to use a tool as a tool, not as a toy. Talking about that with kids, helping them understand, oh, this is because my hands are busy when I'm learning, and that helps me learn. Or if I'm holding something, I might get distracted, right? Learning to teach them the difference. Having a break area that is available to them when they need to take a break and when they want an escape, and how they know how long to spend and how to come back. These are some examples of activities that can be done during a break. And I encourage you to think about giving your kids breaks at home too. Kids need downtime, right? So doing some deep breathing, kind of the way we started this session this evening, right? Where you breathe for 4 seconds and then hold, and then breathe out and then hold. And you can have this visual up and kids can trace it with their fingers until they're feeling more calm. Things like coloring or journaling. I know that a lot of my autistic students have a lot on their mind and they have things they really want to talk about. And so being able to write down an information dump into a journal can be really helpful and calming. Reading and listening to music, watching movies, even if it's the same clip or the same movie over and over, those things can be really helpful for them to process their day. It's a familiar, predictable thing on the screen, and it's okay if they're watching the same thing over and over. That might be a special downtime, right? That could be a break for them. And then also doing things where they get sensory input, right? Where they can roll on different balls or hear different types of things. Excuse me. Oh, the lazy eight breathing. Yeah, I've seen that. That's another really great visual. Or I know a lot of New York City kids like to smell the pizza and then blow it off to cool it before eating it. Yeah, daily checklists help with transitions a lot, Linda. I am a big fan of schedules and checklists in my personal life and in my classroom. Great. Does anybody else have any good examples of breaks they're doing with for themselves or with their autistic and neurodivergent kids? There's really good tips in the chat tonight. So I love that you're sharing with each other. I love that we're all connecting here and giving each other ideas. I think that it's so nice to have a community here because sometimes it can feel overwhelming, but to know that all of us are sort of in the same boat, thinking about the same things, going through the same stuff, there's just comfort in that community. All right. This is a photo of a classroom that is very small. It's a wide angle, but it's a very small classroom. And I put it up here because I want you to know that small spaces can be sensory safe too. Um, so what do you notice about this classroom setup, and how do you think that this classroom is creating a sensory safe environment? The same color and tone. Yeah, you can tell it's a classroom with special needs in mind. It has color, right? It's got a black and white theme. This teacher chose black and white. That doesn't mean you have to choose black and white, but they're keeping to the same color theme, right? The wood tone, it can be warm. The light, right? The lights are dimmed. The surfaces are very clear. The only things on the top of those tables are the kids' names so that they know where their seat is, right? And I'm noticing there's everything is inside of a box. It's contained. There's a label and kids can have access to it, but it's not out. There's not a whole lot of stuff up on the walls. Yes, they're using curtains to covering over shelves, that can make a huge difference. And that doesn't mean you can't access it. You just pull it back to get what's under there. Yeah, students can see each other. It's simple and not overwhelming. Exactly. So these are some inspirational photos. Concerned about the cabinet. Yeah, some kids are quick and fast. I hear you there. This was a second grade classroom, so the kids in this classroom weren't climbing, but Jessica, that's a very good point. If you've got climbers, I would not have tall cabinets because they might climb and knock it over. Good point. Okay, awesome. We're going to move into the third part of my presentation. Yes, labeling bins can increase autonomy in the classroom. Thank you for saying, Celeste. So the third part of tonight's presentation is a little bit of an extra, right? It's about supporting regulation, not just in the environment. I thought that this was kind of a nice thing to include tonight because yes, you can set up a sensory safe environment, but that doesn't mean it's just going to fix all of the problems, right? Some kids are still going to need help regulating in different moments. And so I wanted to leave you with a couple of tips and a little bit of information about that. So let's do a reflection. I want you to think about yourself. What are things that you do to help yourself for your morning routine? What do you like to do when you first wake up? What are some things you do to help yourself in moments of stress? What do you do during your in-between periods, like when you're in between activities? And what do you do at the end of the day, like when you get home from work? When I did this process, I noticed myself that I like to drink hot beverages. That's something that I do in the morning. It's something that I do in my in-between periods. It's something that I like to do when I get home. Like I like the hot beverages. And then I made the connection when I'm driving in New York City traffic, which can sometimes be stressful. I keep a tub of cinnamon gum in my car. So I'm looking for that hot input. I like, I guess, warm temperature things. I like the input that I get from there. And so that's something, that's a connection I made when I did this process. Is anybody else noticing? Yeah, praying, having coffee. Yeah, going to nature. I think this is a really nice thing to do for yourself. Know about what you enjoy doing, what helps you regulate, because I think it can help you understand how others regulate, if that makes sense. Yeah, having those routines, right? Taking medication, doing things to help relax. I love these. These are really good examples. Excuse me. Yeah, if you're about to go camping in an RV, you might need to think about these different things. What can you bring? What are the comforts that you can bring? Yeah. Going by yourself, right? Yeah, sometimes you need a break. Great. So I want to talk about stress responses in the neurodivergent brain. And this isn't to say that they're all that different than stress responses in everyone's brain. But I am going to talk about this from the neurodivergent lens because that's why we're here, right? So we know that neurodivergent, autistic, ADHD brains are under a lot of stress. Much of that is because their sensory processing doesn't have that filter. And so there is a lot of hyper and hyposensitivity to the environment, which puts stress on the nervous system. And so we know that oftentimes a neurodivergent brain is either in fight, flight mode or in freeze and fawn mode. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what each of those mean. It's usually the two pathways of responding, right? Yeah, I just found out I'm autistic and I didn't realize I would just blow up all my life, right? So you would go into fight mode all the time. Exactly. So this can help you understand your nervous system is under more stress than a typical person. And so if your brain goes into fight mode, that means they're going into a defense mode and they're activating with aggression to protect yourself. This is your nervous system being protective. It's not necessarily a choice you're making. Similarly, flight mode is where your brain is telling your body to escape, to get away, to run. And so the fight flight mode is where your brain activates to defend yourself. Whereas the freeze or fawn mode is where your brain might tell your body, hide, freeze, play dead, right? Or where you might fawn and your brain will tell your body to hide signs of distress and just pretend like everything is okay. But that doesn't mean your body's still not under stress. And so it's really important for ourselves and for our kids to look for these signs, to look for signs if they're in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode, because that's a signal to us as friends and caretakers, they need help. Excuse me. And this is where co-regulation comes in. And I love talking about co-regulation on a larger scale. So many of us are families and parents of neurodivergent people, and we're here to help, right? But I think that this is something that's really important in general for us to remember about human beings. Human beings need each other. We are a social species, right? And if we could recognize that we have the power to help regulate with others, I think that's really cool because when someone's storm meets our calm, co-regulation occurs. And so it's important to interpret children's actions as signals of regulation needs, not as bad behaviors. We can think, what might this student's nervous system be trying to tell me? We can recognize that some kids and some students actually engage better when they're moving or not making eye contact or listening to music or doing some other non-normative way of focusing. And we can allow students time and space to figure out those regulatory needs. Stuart Schenker has a lot of information about co-regulation and guiding self-regulation that I think is really interesting stuff. I'm just going to very quickly talk about his method here, but if you wanted to explore more, there's lots of information online. I'm actually just going to put his name in the chat. His name is Stuart Schenker and regulation. So he says that the 5 steps, like the process of regulation, is to first reframe the behavior. Kids aren't doing things to be bad. They're doing things because their nervous system is stressed or they need something in their environment. And so then we can recognize those stressors. We can look for them and we can try to mitigate. We can turn lights off. We can remove stressors. That will reduce the stress, right? And once stress is reduced, there can be a moment of reflection, right? And enhanced awareness. You know what? That subway ride was really loud and overwhelming for me. I think next time I'll bring some headphones. And that will restore energy and help make a plan for next time. Something else that we as caregivers can do, and we as, ourselves can do, is use sensory preferences to help children calm their physical bodies. So think about those things. I like cinnamon gum. I like hot tea. How can that be used to calm my body in a time of need? So it's important to give people and children the opportunity to take breaks and use regulatory tools when they feel it's necessary and not just at the discretion of an adult. Breaks should never be earned. Breaks should be used because only the person who's feeling overwhelmed knows when they need it. We can take the time to explore visual, touch, fragrance, movement, and auditory input to see if any of them have a calming effect. We can introduce new calming ideas like that lazy 8 breathing, like the square breathing, and we can introduce vocabulary around regulation to help kids speak up for what they need. And importantly, we can model and practice with different techniques as a group in order to help the individual. And so the more you model, you know what? Mom needs a break right now because I'm feeling overwhelmed. So I'm going to take some breaths and I'm going to sit down with a cup of tea, right? You can be that model for your child. I have a few ideas of times to add regulation activities throughout the day that I think are really good. This is both for home and school. So in the morning, it's really good to allow brains to warm up and to have check-ins with how people are feeling. So that can be first thing when you wake up, and it can be first thing when you come into the schoolroom. Have some opportunity for connection. Check in. How are we doing? Build in some ways for kids to feel successful first thing in the morning, right? Maybe it's a morning routine that they do all the time and they get it right and then they feel successful right away. During transitions, remember transitions are so important. And so a lot of time is needed around them. Downtime is needed. Processing is needed. If we're moving from one activity to the other, we have to give plenty of time to let that activity go and let our brain move to the other one. And transition routines and movements can help reset the brain for those times. And then, of course, in the afternoon and the evening, there can be more opportunities to check in and reflect, time to process what happened through the day. And reflections can be really nice at this time. I know there are teachers who, during the lineup routine, will ask kid, what was your favorite part of the day? And I know there's also families that do that with each other. Okay. Celeste says, how do we get kids to recognize when they need a break? That is Such an important question, Celeste. And the way that you can do this is through co-regulation. So first of all, remember that your kids are on their own developmental trajectory, and they might not be on that same path that every other kid is. So give them time, okay? They will get there. They will. I think that it's hard, even for adults, to notice, even for neurotypical adults, to notice when we need a break. I don't personally think this is something that we really got taught a lot when we were younger. So remember, we're sort of the first generation teaching our kids to recognize these things about ourselves. So it takes time. But the best way that you can get kids to recognize when they need a break is by saying, I'm noticing, and this is going to be specific to your kid, but I'm noticing that your body feels extra fidgety, or your face changed and you seem to be crying, or you seem to be nervous. Those are signs to me that maybe you might want to take a break, right? Oh, is this something that's feeling really hard for you right now? Do you think that taking a break would be helpful? So just sort of speaking out what you're noticing and helping them, guiding them to notice it too. And practicing different things and talking about it. Did using that tool help? Did taking that break help you in that situation? So it's all about the reflection, really. Very good question. I have a few examples of some regulating activities that I'm going to leave you with before we go into our question and answer. You might have heard of these types of things, but I always like to remind you that they're here. So some things that you can do to regulate your body include like a body scan, where you either tap or squeeze and release many different parts of your body. You can do full class or at-home stretching. Sometimes we call it yoga, sometimes we call it stretching. That can be a really great way to bring awareness to the body. And then incorporating movements in between activities. Every time you switch from one thing to another, play a little movement game or have kids do a few movements to alert their bodies. Some really nice ways that you can regulate your mind are from things like using a chime meditation. So I've seen on the phone or with a real chime where an adult will click it and say, let's listen until we can't hear it resonate any longer. You can do 5 senses mindfulness, where you look for 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and maybe 1 thing you can taste to bring you back into the moment. And then always taking deep breaths can be very helpful. We know that that is something that does help calm the nervous system. The website mindful.org, just putting that into the chat right now, has some really good examples of different regulating activities you can do. Okay,